A friend at work had asked me to make him a cutting board, and I had a lot of extra maple, so why not? But I had a lot of problems. I never thought making a butcher's block or a cutting board would be so difficult. Uh, After doing this, I got a lot of respect for the guys that make those on a day in, day out basis. But I'm glad that I made them so I could learn from it, and hopefully you guys can learn from my mistakes too. So here it is, my cutting boards for maple, and I'm keeping in all the mistakes so you can see exactly what I did wrong so you don't do the same thing.
Before I start my step-by-step, I want to explain a little bit about why I chose maple for these butcher blocks. When you're making butcher blocks or cutting boards, you want to use a hardwood, but you also want to use a hardwood that has small pores. For example, oak is a hardwood, but it has large pores. The reason why that's bad is because once you've cleaned the block off, the large pores retain food and water. That then turns into bacteria and smells, both of which you don't want in anything that's in your kitchen, particularly on something you're going to be cutting food on. So to steer clear from that, you use a hardwood with small pores, such as maple or walnut. I happen to have maple in my shop already, so that's what I used. As you can see, it was rough cut and processed. It was a mix, so I needed them all to be the same width before I was able to glue them together and let them set overnight, which means that my first trip was to the planer. I ran each piece through the planer until they were all the same width, and then I took them to the table saw and I cut them all into strips of 2 inches. Once I had my 2-inch strips, I added my crosscut sled and I cut them all to 1.5 feet long. So what I ended up with was multiple pieces that were 1.5 feet by 2 inches wide. From there, I was able to glue them together, set them in my clamps, and let them dry overnight. And what I ended up with was 2 moderately sized slabs of maple like you see here. And the reason why I have 2 slabs of maple originally was because I only have a 12-inch planer. Had I glued everything together all at once, I wouldn't have been able to process these slabs through the planer again to make them have an even surface. So this is what I did. I had 2 pieces, I ran them through the planer so that they were nice and even, and from there I had a choice. I could keep the slabs like this, and they'd be really nice side grain cutting boards. Or I can take a few more steps and make end grain cutting boards, which is what I chose to do. And the reason why an end grain cutting board is better is because end grains have a way of moving so that your knife blade goes in between the grains instead of getting a little bit pushback from the side grains. This saves the life of your blade and creates an environment that doesn't cause it to dull so quickly. So that's what I wanted to go with, and that's what I chose to do. So after I made these pieces nice and level, I then took them back to the table saw and cut them into 1.5-inch strips so that I was able to then flip over the pieces so that all the end grains were up and glue them together yet again and let them sit in my clamps overnight. Before I go any further, I want to pause for a second to explain this first mistake. And I already knew this was a mistake before I went ahead with this mistake. What happened is I have end grains facing up going through a planer. And if you don't know much about planers, all it is very long blades going at a rotation on top of the wood. And if you have blades rotating with end grains facing up, those blades are going to catch on some of those end grains and split some of that wood. I felt I had no choice. I have limited skills, I have limited tools. I got one hand planer that probably wouldn't do the job, and I figured I'll run it through the planer anyway and just cut off whatever ends don't look that good, which ended up working out in the end. But I knew before going into this that this was going to happen. So all you real woodworkers out there that are experienced in this, you're going to be like, oh man, what is he doing? I knew it was going to happen. So I apologize ahead of time if this upsets some of you. I felt I didn't have a choice. In the future, I'd probably go about it a different way, but here we are. So I've got 2 end grain cutting boards going through the planer with the end grains facing up so that I can get flat surfaces. And now that I have an even surface, I'm able to sand it with my orbital sander down to 150 grit so that I can run it through my router and give it a little bit of a rounded off edge on the tops of the blocks. Once I have that edge, I can then hand sand the blocks down to 320 and get it ready for the first coat of my butcher block coating. Here's where some of you watching may say that I made mistake number 2. I didn't use a regular mineral oil type coating. What I used was something I got on sale. So, first time doing a block, I didn't feel much about it. I'll use whatever I can get for a good price. This is what I went with. And it says to rub it on with a clean, dry cloth. And I started with the poor man's cloth, the paper towel, and gave it a nice, even coat to sit overnight. As with most top coat type products, it tells you to apply one coat, sand it with 400 grit or less, and then apply one more coat, and then to add more coats if desired. Being that this is an end grain board, it's going to soak up more than 2 coats because those end grains will take a lot. So I'm adding my second coat here after sanding it with 400 grit and letting it sit overnight again. Once the second coat is dry, there is a very noticeable difference between the first coat and the second coat. It's a lot thicker, and it's going to take a lot more sanding to get that surface smooth again. And you can't use an orbital sander at this point because if you take too much off, you got to recoat again. So you're going to hand sand this with some heavier grit down to finer grit. I chose to start with 180, then 220, then down to 320. And I got a nice smooth surface. And what you're looking for, if you can see that most of the surface is dull with very few points on the surface that are shiny. What you want is mostly to all dull. That's what you're going for a smooth surface. And if all else fails, go by touch. If it feels smooth, then it's smooth because that's what everybody else is going to look at, how it feels. Once you've established that smooth surface, clean off your boards and put on another coat like I'm doing here. And what I switched to was a regular applicator pad. Now that I have this smooth surface, I want my next coat to be as smooth as possible to require the least amount of sanding as possible so that it's an easy finish. Once that last coat has dried, I get to sand once again. And this sanding is a little bit more intense than previous sandings because not only do you have to establish a smooth surface again, but then you have to sand down finer and finer until it's not dull. And what I was looking for was kind of a satin finish. So I started with my 220 grit, then 320 grit, and from that I went even further. And I went to 400 grit, and then 800 grit, and even further I went to a 2000 grit, which I didn't know if that was too far or if I was going overboard, but I did it. And then I used a non-scratch scrubby pad that you buy in the kitchen section, kind of where you get your steel wool from, but I didn't want to use steel wool on the butcher blocks. I didn't want any of that steel wool particles to be stuck in the butcher blocks, so I used a scrubbing pad that's non-scratch. And once I finished with that scrubby pad, as you see, these didn't turn out half bad. They could have been better, they could have been a lot worse, but the end result, I'm pretty happy with it. And as a finishing touch, I added feet to my cutting boards because you want airflow to go underneath the boards as well so they dry properly. And this is what I ended up with. Not too shabby, I'd say. Again, little mistakes along the way, but I think I'm pretty proud of my work. Until next time, thanks for watching.